famously works at this very pretty building, the United States Capitol building, right? It is straight down the National Mall from the Washington Monument. It's around the corner from the White House. It has that iconic dome. This is where the floor of the House is. It's where the floor of the Senate is. It is where some of the work of the U.S. Congress gets done. More of the work of the U.S. Congress gets done, though, not in that building, but instead at the various House office buildings and Senate office buildings. The Senate has 3 office buildings, and the most well-known of them is this guy. It's a really big building. It's really generic looking, but it is right in the middle of all the action in downtown D.C., and lots of the work of the United States Senate gets done there. And because the building is named after Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois, who served in the 1950s and the 1960s, his name is never far from anybody's mind in Washington, even today. The Dirksen Senate Office Building, named for Everett Dirksen. You ever seen Everett Dirksen? I have always thought he was kind of amazing. Isn't he? He's kind of a cross, I've always thought, between Fred Schneider from the early B-52s and my favorite Muppet. Hi, Beaker. But in 1964, the amazing specimen that was Republican Senator Everett Dirksen, he was the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate. Republicans were in the minority in the Senate. Democrats were the majority there, and Democrats also had the White House. In 1964, of course, the president was Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson had become president after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And although LBJ had long been vocally opposed to the expansion of the Vietnam War, even though he had campaigned for office saying he didn't want to send American boys thousands of miles away to fight a war that Asian boys ought to be fighting for themselves, even though he had campaigned that way and he had believed that the war in Vietnam was a mistake, by 1964, once he was president, LBJ had become convinced that despite everything he said before, the war in Vietnam really needed to be expanded. It should have a much greater U.S. involvement. And so on August 4th, 1964, LBJ made that case to the public in the most dramatic way possible. In a live, late-night, urgent broadcast, President Johnson told the country that the United States Navy had come under attack in the Gulf of Tonkin, just off the coast of Vietnam. President Johnson said there had been open aggression on the high seas against the United States of America, and that the United States of America needed to respond to that aggression. It was a compelling case made in a very serious way. Now, in the long run, it turned out we got snookered. Turns out the whole Gulf of Tonkin thing didn't happen the way that LBJ said it happened at all. But when he said it, back in August 1964, Congress fell in line. As soon as the president gave that speech, his own party in the Senate rallied to his side. The number 2 Democrat in the Senate came out almost immediately after LBJ's speech and said he supported the president and supported what LBJ wanted to do in Vietnam.
I, for one, want to say that I don't think you can be a great power and assume the responsibilities that we do as a free nation for the cause of freedom and run every time somebody starts to draw a bead on you. And I think what President Johnson demonstrated last night was the kind of calm, resolute firmness and decisiveness which will command respect.
So that was Hubert Humphrey, obviously a Democrat. The Democrats in the Senate lining up behind the president of their own party, President Johnson. But President Johnson, a Democratic president, also got down-the-line support from the Republican leadership in the Senate, most explicitly in the case of Everett Dirksen.
In the instances that are immediately before us, I think it's got to be conceded that there has been firm and decisive action. Now, who knows what lies ahead, what the dimensions of attack might be, and where we go from there, and what we do with our larger objectives in Southeast Asia.
So Everett Dirksen, for the Republicans, the Democrats, the Senate as well, everybody is full bore, no reservations, totally lined up, totally supportive of President Johnson's plan to essentially triple down on the war in Vietnam. When the House Foreign Affairs Committee voted on that Gulf of Tonkin resolution, it was unanimous. It was 29-0. In the Senate, they had 2 committees meet together and take a vote. They put the Foreign Relations Committee and the Armed Services Committee together to consider the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And again, there, the vote was totally overwhelming. It was 31-1. Wait a second. Not unanimous, before those Senate committees. Unanimous in the House, not unanimous in the Senate. And then when they took the next step, when the Gulf of Tonkin resolution got out of committee, came up for a full vote on the Senate floor, again, that same guy who voted no in committee voted no again. And for the full floor vote, he got a friend. One of the senators from Alaska joined him. And so, yeah, over in the House, the vote was unanimous on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It was 416 to nothing. But in the Senate, it was not unanimous. It was 88-2. And the man who stood up and said no twice in the Senate against every prevailing wind in Washington was an Oregon senator named Wayne Morse.
Being in the minority never proves that you're wrong. In fact, history is going to record that Senator Greening and I voted in the interest of the American people this morning when we voted against this resolution. And I'd have the American people remember what this resolution really is. It's a resolution which seeks to give the President of the United States the power to make war without a declaration of war.
Oregon Senator Wayne Morse. He was right about that. That vote, where it was 88-2, and he was one of the two. That vote was the closest that Congress ever got to a declaration of war in the Vietnam War, which cost 50,000 American lives and lasted more than 8 years. And not for nothing, what the Senate was voting on there was technically a response to this supposed incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, which proved in the end to be bullpucky. It was not what the president said it was. It did not happen the way they described it to Congress. It was a made-up pretext. And all of Congress went along with it, but not Oregon Senator Wayne Morse. And as Congress again today considers reports of a grave and terrible provocation in a faraway place as a potential justification for American military commitment that they otherwise would not take without that provocation. Today, there's no reason to believe that the claims about chemical weapons use in Syria are as shaky and even made up as reports from the Gulf of Tonkin back in 1964. But the point of the Wayne Morse place in history, the whole heroism of the Wayne Morse story, is not actually that he was right. He had not magically disproved the Gulf of Tonkin thing when he said no. The heroism of the Wayne Morse example in history is that he did say no. And our history as a country shows, despite the impression you might be getting from reading the Beltway media these days, our history as a country shows that again and again, some people can say no even when everybody else says yes. When the war drums beat in Washington, again and again, people do say no. And sometimes they're all alone when they say it. Sometimes it is Wayne Morse and Senator Greening from Alaska acting alone in 1964. Sometimes it's Barbara Lee, alone in 2001. Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California was the one vote in either House of Congress in 2001 who voted against what turned into our 13-year-long war in Afghanistan that we are still in now. In the first Iraq War, the Gulf War of 1991, that we look back on now and think of as an easy call, right? One of the good wars. It was super clear what was going to happen there. This aggression will not stand, man. Well, you know what? Turns out that was actually a close vote. It was close in the House, and it was really close in the Senate. Among the senators who are still around now who voted no against that, voted no against the first war in Iraq in 1991, were Chuck Grassley of Iowa, Carl Levin, another man you might have heard from recently named John Kerry, then a senator from Massachusetts. Also the man who is currently our vice president, Joe Biden. They all voted no on the first Gulf War. 47 senators voted no. And that does not mean they were always voting no on every use of force. 8 years later, in 1999, Bill Clinton was president, and he wanted to go to war to stop the slaughter in Yugoslavia. And look at how those votes went. On March 23rd of that year, 1999, it was Joe Biden who introduced the resolution to authorize President Clinton to go send those forces to Kosovo. March 23rd, look at the timing here. March 23rd, the Senate votes yes. It was nowhere near unanimous. That was a close vote, too. But Joe Biden put up the resolution. The Senate says yes. The very next day, the airstrikes start, because President Clinton did not wait around for the House to vote on it as well. And by the time the House finally did vote on it a month later, they voted yes, or no, or neither really. Look at the House vote, which again was taken a month after the airstrikes had already started. The House vote was 213 to 213. It was a direct tie, and that means that that resolution did not pass in the House. President Clinton got authorization from the Senate. He did not get authorization from the House, but by the time they took that vote not giving him authorization, airstrikes were already underway. President Clinton's State Department spokesman at the time wrote about that in the New York Times this week. He says, when you look back on that use of force, he would argue that it was a legitimate use of force, even though it was, quote, not strictly legal. Of course, the vote that looms largest right now in Washington, even though I think the administration would wish that it didn't, the vote that looms largest right now is the one that was taken in late 2002 to authorize the second war in Iraq. And yes, Congress did vote to authorize the use of military force in that war. But a lot of people voted no. Nearly 2/3 of the House Democrats said no to the Iraq war. There were 133 no votes in the House. In the Senate, there were 23 no votes, including a lot of senators who are still there now. Senator Boxer, Senator Durbin, Leahy, Levin, Mikulski, Patty Murray, Jack Reed, Debbie Stabenow. Also a man from Oregon who holds the seat that used to be Wayne Morse's seat, Ron Wyden of Oregon. He voted no on the Iraq war. And so, yes, Congress usually votes overall to authorize force when they get around to considering it. But people vote no. Voting no is a thing that happens, even against the strongest possible prevailing winds. And right now in Washington, there are not the strongest prevailing winds in favor of the U.S. military intervening in Syria. Quite the contrary. Lots of different places are doing sort of informal whip counts now, where they're trying to canvass members of the House and members of the Senate to get those members to say how they're going to vote on Syria, when the full House and the full Senate ultimately have to make their decisions on these things. People are tracking those likely votes over the course of yesterday and today. And again, these are all unofficial tallies being done by different news organizations. And the debate is not done, and there are briefings that are yet to be had. But if you've at all been watching the whip counts, these whip counts evolve over the last couple of days, it shows that almost all of the movement is in the direction of not going. All of the momentum is in the direction of no. Most members of Congress say they are undecided, but when they are getting themselves out of the undecided column and they are deciding no, by and large. And, you know, none of those counts as official until they officially count the official vote. But if you had to take a snap vote right now, if you had to guess the way that this was going to go, if you had to predict it from here, it looks like Congress is going to vote it down. Congress is going to turn down this request to authorize the use of military force, maybe in the Senate and probably in the House. And that will be added to the fascinating and pretty poorly remembered history of members of Congress saying no to war when they got the chance to say no. But it also becomes a totally unpredictable next chapter, not for Congress, but for the presidency. If Congress says no, and right now it looks like Congress is going to say no, will those military strikes happen anyway? President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry keep asserting over and over again that they believe they have the right to go on their own even if Congress says no. Are they right? What would that mean? And how uncharted are those waters for us as a country? Joining us now is NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Mr. Beschloss, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Rachel. Could I add someone else to the Wayne Morse tradition of members of Congress saying no?
Please.
There was a congressman from my home state of Illinois in 1847 who spoke out against the Mexican-American War named Abraham Lincoln. And there had been, as you well know and you've written about, it was said by President Polk there was an unprovoked attack by Mexicans on American territory, and Lincoln said, "Show me the spot where that happened." That's how Lincoln first came to the attention of the American public.
It's interesting. We remember presidents as associated with various wars. We don't necessarily associate congressional action and congressional votes with wars, with some exceptions. It seems to me from an originalist reading of the Constitution that Congress has the power to declare war. We don't usually declare war anymore. Is there clarity, either in history or in law, about what it means for the Congress to not authorize the use of military force? If the president asks them to and they say no, is that binding?
The founders would be horrified, because when they were writing the Constitution, one of the things they were worried most about was that this new office of the presidency that they were creating, it would become like the kings of Europe or the dictators, where, you know, the old European leaders would generate wars that were not necessary and take the nation into these wars, kill a lot of people. They didn't want our president to do that sort of thing. They very specifically said it's the Congress that should have the power to declare war. Yet, you look through American history, 200 years, only 5 wars have been declared by Congress. I think we fought a few more than that.
When you look at the ways that presidents have dealt with bulky Congresses, when they wanted to wage wars that Congress didn't want them to wage, the things that spring to mind are the Boland Amendment during the Reagan administration, where Congress knew that the president wanted to go to war in Central America, or at least join some existing wars in Central America, and the Congress wrote a law that would have prevented, at least in law, President Reagan from doing that. He violated that law and secretly got involved in Central America in the Iran-Contra affair. Are there other examples of ways that presidents have either legally or illegally defied Congress's explicit views?
Yes, and not only in wars that we would necessarily disapprove of. You go back to 1941, Franklin Roosevelt was desperate to get the United States in a position where we might have to fight against Hitler and the Imperial Japanese. This was an isolationist country, very isolationist Congress, and he got into some pretty dicey situations in the North Atlantic where there were American vessels that were in pretty grave danger of getting hit by a German sub, which would have been terrible, but Roosevelt would have known that that would have provided a pretext to get the kind of involvement in World War II that he felt was necessary.
How does the war in Iraq, in your view as a historian, how does the Iraq war and the decisions about the Iraq war loom over these decisions being debated by Congress right now? You can sort of see the two sides trying to draw different allusions. The people who are saying no keep referencing Iraq. The people who are saying yes keep referencing the Balkans, and other ones that maybe put a nicer shine on it.
You don't identify with a failure.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, for people, who can only remember, who don't know a lot of history, Iraq, needless to say, gives people a lot of reason to be skeptical about what they're told about the reasons that we have to go to war. But you can find those all the way through American history. Mexican War, I mentioned, Spanish-American War, the sinking of the Maine, we were told that we had to fight against Spain because of this terrible attack, which very likely was not an attack. And you mentioned tonight Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So all through history, there's a tendency of presidents straining to get a war from Congress that they want, sometimes in retrospect for good reasons, as I think we both would say about FDR in World War II, but sometimes not.
Do you think, and I'm asking you to speculate here, but do you think if President Obama is told no by Congress and he decides to go ahead anyway, as he and John Kerry have asserted they might, can you foresee what their historical allusion will be to say there is precedent for that kind of action? Do you think it will be FDR?
I would be very surprised if they do not mention Kosovo, 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 and say that this was an effort where Congress did not approve the Kosovo operation. There were 78 days of bombing. It was part of the NATO operation. They finally won a peace treaty, ended the atrocities by the Serbs in Kosovo. So that was a successful effort that they have every reason to try to identify this venture with.
Michael Beschloss, NBC News presidential historian. It's always great to have you here. Thanks, Michael.
Me too. Thanks. You, Rachel. And a happy 5th anniversary.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice of you to say. Oh, I'm all embarrassed. We're almost 5.